In today's episode I'm going to show you Cimmerit wash, extra effects with oil paints, making rust on exhausts, chipping, polishing, mud on the bottom, dusting, stains and scratches on the sides. Hello my friends, I'm Lucas and you are watching coldemonspl. This is a starting point. Well, I hope you remember it from the previous episode, so before we get down to work, let's take a little bit of standard procedure, reminding you to subscribe to the channel, click likes and write comments. You know that I needed to develop the channel and position it in YouTube rankings, so click our favorite subscribe button and let's get it over with. Thank you very much. Doing a Cimmerit wash is always a dangerous topic. Some of us like it, some don't. Some people prefer to leave it as it is, others use wash to emphasize its structure. I'm in the middle. On the one hand, I don't like when the wash darkens the color of the paint, on the other hand I cannot imagine leaving such surfaces without underlining. How do I get out of such a situation? I found and uses such a solution, I can say, two-part. First, I do a very gentle wash on the Cimmerit surface. You can even say that it is almost a dark paint filter. What is important, I wet the surface with the thinner beforehand so that the paint can easily spread. Here I used Modeler's World products for this, which did their job perfectly. Of course, at the end I dried everything up with the accelerator. As you can see, the paint spreads nicely in the holes. In addition, wash is useful for streaks on vertical surfaces. I use this feature on side shields. The intensity depends on the amount of product applied. Supper's bridges were also properly treated, although dirt and dust will cover these places later anyway. The rest of the wash is simply highlighting all the elements regardless of whether it's the line of welds and protruding screws. Even though there is no shiny varnish on the model, there were no problems with controlling the product. Everything was going smoothly. I also used the method of wetting the surface on the front section with hatches for the driver and radio operator. Before the paint dried a bit, I had time to put some of it into the weld lines. Cleaning the excess of the wash is quick work with a clean thinner. Well, let's say mine was clean. The same work was done on the rear plate of the vehicle. Here we have more details, for example the number of screws, so it takes a while longer than the other parts of the model. Doing a wash on cells is also not a big problem. We just add a little more thinner and cover the whole element. The paint should flow into the recesses without any problem. Obviously, it's worth to speed up the drying with our favorite tool, which is accelerator, of course. On the turret I use a method of spreading wash on the damp surface again. It was very fast. As you can see, the shells keep the surface very good and the wash perfectly emphasized their presence. All cell bonds were treated the same as the previous one. And that would be all about wash. Not much, but this is the basic step that needs to be done to make our model look interesting and three-dimensional. Now it's time for some oil paints. On a piece of cardboard I squeezed a dozen or so colors that I planned to use on my Panther. For the purpose of the video I have already done some surface, and these are exactly the ones I'm showing now. We've got bright and cimmerit on the right and dirt near the driver's hatch. First a bit of dark color, and more specifically dark grey to prepare the surface made dirty by the crew. As you can see, all the work is tapping and using the thinner. The paint is easy to put on and the effect is visible after a while. We can add any quantity, it all depends on what we want to get. And again we come back to the cimmerit and more specifically to the second part of its preparation. Here you can see the difference between what I'm about to apply. This part on the right is almost complete and the one on the left will be ready in a moment. As you remember, the first was a very gentle wash, and now to improve the appearance of the structure and even to lighten it up a bit, because even a very diluted wash causes the paint to darken, we will use a mixture of light yellow and light brown paint to do this. At the same time, this color will be used for delicate paint damages. The problem is to use the brush very gently so that all traces of paint are subtle. You could say it's a dry brush method, but with a little more paint. Even an old damaged brush can come in handy for this. Anyway, have a look at how I work on it. I did exactly the same on the turret, but here I spent much more time on the cimmerit damages. Each of them has been painted on the edges, thanks to which they are more visible and the surface isn't boring. And again we are taking a dark grey color to get the dirty done by the crew. In the case of the turret it will be the bottom edge of the hatch at the back and the commander's turret. We get the desired effects pretty quickly. By the way, it's a good idea to have a clean brush handy to spread the paint evenly over the surface. The brush with which we apply the color isn't a good option for this. It's also worth doing some highlights on small elements. In the case of camo vehicle it won't be so convincing, but when our model is painted in one color, for example green, it's worth doing it. Even earlier at the stage of painting and with oil paints, emphasize or change the color tone even more. It isn't a complicated job, but it's worth planning in advance and choosing the right paints. With dark colors you can also separate the individual armor panels. It can be done with the light shade as well. Now it's a good time to mention my patrons who joined the Coldemons team. Thank you guys so much. If you also want to be my patron, check what benefits you can have when you support me. You can find the link in the description and at the end of this video. Don't waste your time and join the team. Now a quick repeat of the places that have been additionally enriched with the oil paints. Alright, now we turn to painting the scratches. For this I will use a base paint which may not be perfect in terms of brush properties, but has a perfect shade, and in my opinion this is the best solution. The color contrasts well enough, not too light or too dark. First we will prepare the exhaust pipes. At the earlier stage I painted them dark brown, now I will apply sand camo as negative chipping. The difference between positive and negative chipping is that what you can see here and the effect that will be visible in a moment. They are negative or color painted on the surface to create a layer of damaged paint. A positive chipping is simply painting the chips in the most standard way we all use, with paints, chipping fluids or whatever. The exhaust pipes will now be coated with diluted rust-colored oil paint. We can say that it's a filter that I put in several layers to differentiate the volume. And finally a bit of black on the ends to make a base for the black pigment that I will apply later. Towing cables also need some love. The color of the ends is slightly different than the base color because I used dark yellow from Vallejo to paint them, but that's good because the colors are different and this creates more interest. Of course you can paint them in a completely different shade, for example green, Panther Grey or just silver grey, as an unpainted element. It all depends on our imagination. Well, back to chipping. I treated them exactly like the other elements on the model. As you can see here, the camo color is perfect for painting scratches and more precisely to paint the base under the scratches. Of course, in a situation like this, when we already have ropes glued to the model, we need to bend a little so that all visible surfaces are properly treated. The ropes are done, now it's time to play on other elements of the model. Mudguards, side shields and all surfaces where such an effect was possible were painted. I always have a moment to wonder how much of this work will be visible in the end. Well, it has to be done, although from some time I come to the conclusion that the number of scratches should be reduced. But that's another story. I begin to fill in light scratches with diluted dark brown 822 Vallejo paint, which is the best for chipping. And now there is a great contrast right away, where you can clearly see all our work put into planning and painting individual places. This is where most of the chips will be covered with dust, but it's still fun to watch as the next chips appear. Under the turret I very often paint an imitation of scratches that can appear when a hard object gets in there, for example a stone from the ground thrown into the air during a fight and falling on a vehicle. Most of them won't be visible anyway, but here, where the model will be presented in the version with the turret rotated, some of these scratches will be shown to the viewer. Of course, you also need to check to what extent the turret rotates, so as not to overdo it and not to get out of the outline, because it will look strange. By the way, you can clearly see the screw mounting for the holder. It will stay there permanently, I don't want to fight to take it out. Such, let's say, the load element. Okay, we are still working on filling the scratches and I can put a little rust on them in a moment. Exactly in the subject of rust, I was wondering how much this type of vehicles could rust. Well, not too much considering their lifespan. So on this model I decided to do just a little on the engine plate where the temperature was favorable for its formation, and of course on the exhaust. And it will remain so because it seems logical to me. So if someone expects extremely battered and rusty vehicles, forgive me, but not here. Of course I don't give up on this effect, but it will be used to a lesser extent than before. Well, when it comes to rust, I put a small amount of oil paint and after a while I dissolve it with a little amount of thinner to create a filter. You can leave it to dry or speed it up with the accelerator and it's ready. There is a lot of fun with this effect and you can see exactly how I did it on the fender. Pencil in hand and let's do some metallic effect, because after all our tank was made of steel, as were most of its accessories. It's not a rocket science, but I'd like to clarify a few things. The towing cables will look much better after polishing with graphite due to their construction. By whipping with a pencil the entire weave will be visible. It's important not to scratch the paint, which can happen when we work on it with too much force or the paint doesn't stick well enough. In addition, we get a nice contrast between the dusty surface of the model and the metallic rope. The second place I would like to highlight is the commander's turret rim for the machine gun. This element is very often too polished, almost sparkling, which is a mistake for me. Let's consider how much it would be necessary to move the mount of the machine gun to make this rim sparkle like railroad tracks. Unreal. Therefore, do it gently right on the edges, it will look much better and more realistic. I polished also all machine guns, maybe too much in some places, but I leave that to your judgment. In addition to the pencil, I also used the silicone tip, which is also perfect for rubbing the graphite into the paint. Another detail is the jerry can, which was first covered with weathering paint, the same that I applied to the wheels and which will appear on the rest of the model in a moment. I used the brush here to check how the paint will behave, but I still have to check this method on larger surfaces. Of course, a little bit of polishing with a pencil and we can consider this element done. Dear viewers, use the foil for baking plate. Aluminium foil will be useful to cover the finished chassis. All this in order not to impose on them effects that will be applied to the higher sections of the model in a moment. The foil is so flexible that it's easy to arrange and it sticks to the edges of the model itself. Just note how easy it is to work with it. I load the airbrush with paint and start applying some dust. Note that generally I paint lower surfaces, reducing the amount of paint in the higher places. In this way I will get the effect of road dust settling on the surface of the vehicle. I treat it as a basis for further work, but you can leave it at this stage if you want your model to look more smooth. Of course, dust is applied to all elements, even the additional ones, as if they had been hanging there for a long time and had already become covered with dust. Of course, we don't leave it to dry freely, but we use the accelerator so we don't waste time. We take off the foil that has already done its job and we can put some dust on the top surfaces. Also, on the turret you should slightly prepare some places where dust may have accumulated. Of course, the same products as before are used to make thick mud, quite random proportions, generally to brighten up a little bit of stirred earth. I put it on the lower parts of the fuselage, trying to add additional dry pigment. I apply this mud with an old brush, trying to do it in a quite random way and at the same time make sure that there isn't too much of it, which could conflict with the previously finished chassis. Apart from the fact that the dry pigment was mixed with mud, I also apply it without any additives. With an ordinary cotton bud they stick into the surface of the model as well as roll it, and thanks to this I get an interesting effect. In some places, such as around the trucks, the pigment has been glued with white spirit. Thanks to this, you can get the effect of accumulated mud, which after some time has built up a thicker layer. We are constantly working on making the model muddy. On supper bridges you also need to add a little bit of it due to the way they were used. The set transported by one vehicle could be arranged as two separate spans or as one section. Then one bridge entered the other, blocking itself with teeth. That's why I put mud on them, which could undoubtedly be left there after using them in the field. As you can see, adding pigment to the finished mixture causes the mud to naturally settle on the surface and doesn't cover the entire surface in an even manner. Okay, that's enough of this talking, just look how I put mud on the elements of the model. Okay, I'm back. Of course, the falling Zeltbahn was also properly soiled. Thanks to this, it looks as it has been riding in this position for some time and the crew wasn't too interested in the sliding equipment. In such execution of the model, it's necessary to unify all surfaces so that there aren't too glaring contrasts. Of course, it's worth having them, but it isn't advisable to go to extremes. This is why all Zeltbahns on the hull and turret were also dusty, of course less than the one hanging on the side of the vehicle. I rub off the excess dust with my finger. Yes, I know, but I did it on purpose because I knew what effect it would give. I didn't mark my fingerprints, but only whipped off the pigment from the edges and more exposed surfaces. This is a really simple task and an easy to achieve result. It may not look very professional, but it works, and probably if I hadn't shown it, no one would guess how I did it. Some more edge dusting at the bottom of the turret and on the flat surfaces around the turret ring and on the engine plate. This amount of pigment is enough. One of the last effects I usually add on models are stains from spilled operating fluids and water or drinks. I use thinner and dark brown wash for this purpose. 2 coats do the job for brushing big spots and 1 speckling for tiny spots. Depending on the needs, we add a smaller or larger amount of the thinner. You can see this especially when you compare the stains on the engine plate with what's under the exhaust and on the side skirts. In each of these places there is different proportions of wash and thinner, which results in various effects that I obtained. Note that such spots have also been painted on the underside of the hull. It enriches the muddy surface, and if someone looks underneath, then we'll have something to watch. One of my favorite effects, but at the same time risky to perform, are scratches made by bushes and branches. A sharp knife is the only tool needed to make it. It's enough to gently guide the blade over the surface that was previously muddy and dusty, or dusty and muddy, doesn't matter. Gently and with sensitivity. The cut edges can be then smoothed out with a dry brush. And it's done. Just a quick black pigment contamination of the exhausts, and we can deal with the last element of the model, without which my work couldn't be finished. A piece of chain. Here I have a short one which was previously soaked in blackening solution, dried and hidden awaiting its turn. Now I will add some sand pigment to it and hang it in the rear hull. I set the model on the jig from Octopus, which is perfect for such tasks, and added the chain. Of course you have to remember about a reasonable arrangement to make it look realistic. To prevent it from falling off while maneuvering the model, I stuck it with a pigment fixer. A drop here, a drop there, and I'm sure that it will hang there permanently. And today's stage is over. Before you turn off this video, I hope you will hear my request for subscription, likes and comments. Thanks! If you are interested in the next stages of work on this model, I invite you to next parts because it's not over yet. That's all for today. Cheers!